I'm Jennifer Brunton. I was assigned female at birth, autistic human. I use she, they pronouns. And as you probably noticed, I'm the author of this book, The Actually Autistic Guide to Advocacy, as well as a forthcoming book, which, not to be rude, I'm way more excited about actually. It's called The Actually Autistic Guide to Building Independence. So we wrote this book together, my co-author and I, as our children were kind of like in their tweens and teen years, and as we were writing it and getting it in and getting it published and everything, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, but we kind of realized that one of the most challenging things for autistic people is finding their way into adulthood, finding their way into doing the things that seem to come a lot more easily to neurotypical people because the world is built for neurotypical people. So that book is coming out next summer. We're turning in the final draft of the whole book at the end of September, and I will talk more about it. But I'm also incredibly excited about our first book, which really talks about the principles for advocacy. I also write this Full Spectrum Mama blog, as she explained. That's how I got into sort of this space of being a public writer and advocate. And I work as an editor and writer, mostly about business, but also like science, tech, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the corporate world. I've worked with some pretty high-level corporate stuff. I do a lot of writing for like Forbes and Guidehouse and Content de Novo, like different kind of high-level corporate stuff. But my heart is really with this work, but that pays the bills. In my spare time, I'm a partner to a neurotypical person who baffles me a lot. I baffle him too. I have a 17, almost 18, and next week, senior year daughter, neurotypical. And I also live with my autistic son and his neurodivergent partner and their 1-year-old and soon to be another child in November. And it's a lot. But as you can see, my advocacy is grounded in a lot of personal experience. So a lot of personal experience as an autistic person, myself, who has experienced a lot of different environments, workplaces, a lot of educational settings, and then also especially as a mom. My life has made me a really fierce advocate, and I've learned a ton along the way. So I'm here to speak from my own perspective, but I'm also here to share the experiences and ideas and advice of the more than 100 autistic people we interviewed for the first book and the more than 100 autistic people, largely teens and young adults, who we surveyed and interviewed for the second book. I'm especially focused these days on making the world a better place to grow up in and make your way as an autistic person. I want autistic youth to know that their voices matter, and I'm really passionate about empowering them to dream big and to expect better from the world. So I'll be integrating insights from our second book too. One of the main things I've really been thinking about lately is, as we wrote about independence, is the idea of interdependence. One of the things that we look at people who differ from the norm as needing, in some way needing more, right? But what we don't think about is that the world is actually set up to help neurotypical people, right? We have things like college scholarships and housing loans and law school. We have all these different kinds of institutions that are set up to help people and to support us in our interdependence. But neurodivergent people may need slightly different interventions or slightly different institutions. They don't really need necessarily more help, they need different help, right? We're all counting on each other to get through life here on this planet. So I'm gonna speak tonight about how both neurotypical and neurodivergent people, especially autistic people, so again, whether that's ourselves, our parents, our partners, our siblings, other family members, teachers, educators, friends, therapists, students, right? Or anyone else interested in furthering inclusion and positive evolution can either self-advocate or advocate or ally with autistic people in ways that aren't based on the opinions of professionals or experts who talk about autism, but are based on the actually autistic experiences of autistic people. So the way that our writing goes and our advocacy goes is really centering autistic experiences and uplifting and amplifying our experiences, our perspectives. So I'm going to discuss both mindsets, so like ways of thinking, and actions, things we can do that will really explicitly and actively reject a deficit mindset or discriminatory mentalities. And instead, these are ideas and actions that proactively make life better for autistic people so that we can take steps to grow together in a meaningful way. And when I think very deeply about it, I really believe that when one person rises, we all rise. So these shifts that I suggest tonight really should make life better for everyone. So a couple little specifics about the talk. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit more about myself, my own neurodivergent history. I'm going to put on my reading glasses, and then I really won't be able to see you, so I'm sorry. I'm awkward to start with, but when I can't even see, it's a whole nother level. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. Then I'm going to talk about the fundamental premises of my work and my books. And I'll pause now and then. That's just too hard. I'll stay farther away from my... I'm going to pause occasionally for clarification questions, if you have questions around terms or something that I said that didn't make sense. And then I'm going to get a little deeper into the principles of actually autistic advocacy for maybe about half an hour. And I'll pause again. Anytime anyone needs a pause, I'm happy to pause, or if you have a question. Let's leave the more substantive questions for the end. By that I mean, like, if you have a question that is more deep or more specific or something, we'll leave it to the Q&A at the end. But if you have a question about, like, what did you just mean when you said that, please feel free, and I will pause and ask if you have questions like that. A few quick housekeeping details. I have a mailing list sign up there. I used to give these talks with a visual, and I just have found that I cannot do both at the same time. I would forget to change the page, and then everyone would get even more confused. So I have a visual that's designed to kind of lead you through the points that I make, and I can send that out to you if you put your email on there. I have a resource sheet that has a book discount link for our book. And it has, we just closed our survey for the second book, so it doesn't, I'm going to take the survey link off. It also has a link to a free discussion guide we made. When I first started giving talks, I was terrified all the time, even though I had taught at the university level for many years. It was a lot to focus on my own work in a talk. And some very nice people at the Forbes Library in Northampton suggested that I run book clubs instead. I didn't end up doing that, but we developed a discussion guide that you can get on our publisher's website. I'm really proud of it. It's really, it really shapes, you can have, like, I think it's a 10-week or 10-month, like whether you're meeting weekly or monthly. It's all about, there's like an intro to each section, and there's discussion questions. Also in the book, we have questions for reflection at the end of each chapter. But this is something that's free. You can literally just go to the publisher, and it has kind of like a synopsis of each chapter and then some questions to discuss. So if you sign up, if you give me your email back there on that mailing list, I can send you all of those resources, a link to the discussion guide, the visuals, and then also I send out mailings, like, I'm going to say an average of maybe 2 times a year, never more than 3 times, sometimes just once a year. And the next mailing that I would probably send out would be a book for when the next book comes out. So if you like, sign up on that mailing list, or maybe I'll pass it around at the end of the talk. And also, I wanted to say that I do have some slow auditory processing, so sometimes it might take me a minute to come up with an answer for a question, but please just be patient with me. So before I even start talking about my own neurodivergent journey and the basic principles of actually autistic advocacy, I just wanted to say that it's been a really chaotic few years, and I think it's very brave to be together in community. I think it's really important that we do this. we're all a little off kilter, maybe even a little scared these days. So we're here together. I think we're all still reckoning with the impact of the pandemic, the impact of the geopolitical and environmental chaos we've been living in, and that impact particularly on vulnerable populations, including neurodivergent people. But I also hold out hope that we're kind of in this time of flux where we have opportunities to shape things differently as well. For example, the whole predominance of Zoom now, like many neurodivergent people are more comfortable interacting on screens. Some aren't, but it gives us another way that we might possibly work with things. I think that a lot of schools had to scramble to come up with new ways to educate students during the pandemic, and some things went very, very, very wrong, but other things went well, and we have just some new ideas coming out of all of this. And I'm also really glad we're getting actually autistic voices out there to help with any of that positive evolution. So, brief history of my own neurodivergent journey. Biologically born females have a very complicated history with both diagnosis and recognition. They are the people, anecdotally, who are most likely to be said, "You don't look autistic." You get that a lot. I know. I'm always like, wow. I've stopped. I used to take it personally, but now I just kind of like, okay. I actually wrote some ranting blog posts about that, actually, so I'm not acting like I'm actually so mellow about it, but, I try. I had a very, very happy childhood, actually. I was super happy in my own little world, and I know everything about, for example, cats, right? Dinosaurs, cats, tropical fish. One of my obsessions was early 1980s mail-order makeup kits. There were these like clubs that you could join, and I wasn't supposed to be wearing makeup, but I was obsessed. So if you want to know about any of those things, or even some of my more recent obsessions, such as gardening, I've got you. I could tell you everything about them. I became a pretty miserable teenager and young adult. I saw that I was different, and I didn't quite understand how. I noticed that I was being marginalized, but when I tried to deal with it, it didn't work. My family also, there was a lot of family chaos, so that was part of it too. I grew up trying to pass as a normal person. It never really worked. I was like always the person, for example, when I was a punk rocker, I had a fluffy mohawk. Like I didn't have any spikes on my mohawk. I was always a little off. I realized I was autistic while I was in graduate school in my late 20s when I was at Columbia. I read a book called Nobody Nowhere, which now I think was probably a pretty rough introduction to the autistic brain, but at the time there really wasn't much out there. So I read this book and really related to the person. I thought, okay, I finally figured it out. I was diagnosed in my late 30s, and that at that time was a non-event. At that time I was going through a rough divorce, and I was a working single mom with young, high-needs kids. I was going through my son's autism diagnosis with him, and my own diagnoses with some other more complicated actual health problems, autoimmune stuff, and complex PTSD. But I was never really an activist, right? I just kind of was like, oh, okay, I'm autistic, that's why I'm weird, okay. That was what I thought. And then over the last 15 years or so, and mostly through parenting my incredibly brilliant, incredibly kind, incredibly funny, I know I'm a very objective, my son, who also has learning differences, and getting him through the special education system as whole and unharmed as possible, as well as seeing him bullied. And also something that I found, bullying is absolutely horrible. Something that I also found very horrible in his experience was that he was often underestimated by the people who were entrusted with his education. So through that was what really made me an advocate and an activist, dedicating myself to educating people and fighting with people too, in the IEP meetings and things like that. He had a lot of allies, but there were some really rough points. And that also kind of made me more of a writer, because my blog was anonymous, but I would really work things out on that blog. And I had, at one point, I think I had about 300,000 readers, and And that was a great connection. Like if you are an autistic person or a parent or a loved one of an autistic person and you're struggling, there's some really great kind of resources out there to connect with people that can really help. And that really helped a lot. Like many of my neurodivergent friends and peers and colleagues, I've gone to more than the average amount of schools. One place would not be a good fit, or et cetera. And I've also explored a lot of different careers. Again, this is kind of anecdotal, but I know one person that I'm pretty close to who is a pretty well-known autistic person is John Elder Robeson. I don't know if anybody knows him. He wrote a bunch of books that were pretty big bestsellers, like Look Me in the Eye and Raising Cubby. I don't know. Anyway, he's a friend of mine, and we've talked about how both of us just tried a lot of different careers. Like we didn't have that part in our brain that was like, oh, well, you don't know how to do that, so don't do it. We just tried a lot of different things, and there were a lot of mismatches, et cetera. I was a yoga center owner. I owned real estate. I was a professor. I've done nonprofit work. Finally, I landed on writer-editor, which really suits my neurology quite well. But it was hard to find a good fit. Right, I was always able to do the work, which was a privilege. Not everybody can do that. But the social and cultural and environmental stuff was kind of hard. So over all those years, I came to understand that it's not so much the details of the environment or a relationship that create equity and equality and inclusion. It's more, and by that I mean equity, equality, and inclusion for everybody, right? It's more the tone, like the intention of an environment or relationship. So does a person you're interacting with or a group you're joining or an environment or an institution that you're getting educated in or working in, does that institution or person welcome all people or not? Welcoming places and cultures are not necessarily so much like overtly or specifically autism friendly as they are human friendly. Right? So you'll have people who might look and identify differently, and yet they feel comfortable together. So institutions or workplaces or homes or families that are full of open-minded and genuinely diverse or open people, they probably don't even give a rip if you're neurodivergent, right? Some examples from our new book, we actually ask a question about this in our survey, which was like, where are some places where you feel comfortable? And a lot of people said libraries, so or bookstores. I felt incredibly comfortable in the undergraduate college that I went to, Bryn Mawr College. It's one of the Seven Sisters, but in graduate school, I felt very uncomfortable. It's just kind of a different attitude in the space. So in inclusive places like that, people, including autistic people, will be able to more easily and comfortably express their needs, right? Whether they have environmental or social or other needs, and feel seen and feel heard. And people will accept any differing needs or types of goals or adaptations that might be necessary, or accept different ways of presenting as a human being to be sort of basic to the way human beings are, that humans are wonderfully diverse. And in these spaces, people acknowledge and encourage that kind of interdependence where it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to cook you a nice meal and you're going to drive the car. People have different skills to bring to these relationships. And so many of us, not just autistic people, but a lot of people who don't fit the typical mold. And one of the groups that I've heard compared to how autistic people often feel is immigrants, right? Like, so people who come from different cultures, it's almost like, some autistic people will say, I feel like I landed on the wrong planet or something. So when I talk about some of these challenges, they're like a challenge of navigating another culture, right? Neurodivergent versus neurotypical culture. So many of us, and again, like I just said, not just autistic people, but people who don't fit that typical mold may struggle in a home, school, workplace, or other environment that feels judgmental or regimented. We can struggle in environments where there are rules that we don't understand or there's an unspoken social code. But in those open and accepting spaces and cultures, we will flourish. And and will grow. So we ourselves are more likely to succeed, but we're also adding to that culture for everyone's benefit. I want to read a quote here. This is from one of the people we interviewed for the first book, named Jamie Knight. He's a writer and developer from the UK. He says, "Many neurotypical advocates think that autism causes behaviors. In my experience, that's backwards. Badly designed environments cause barriers, and barriers cause behaviors. Badly designed environments disable everyone. Because most environments don't consider my needs, I encounter more design errors than other people do. Remove the environmental barriers and I thrive. I think good autism advocacy focuses on removing barriers in the environment. Barriers may be built things, attitudes, expectations, or assumptions." So I'm going to be sharing some more detailed ideas about how to advocate and foster such environments. But I think the bottom line is that they start with the intention to create comfort and safety and inclusivity for everybody. And that comfort and safety and inclusivity rests on these principles that we write about in the Actually Autistic Guide. But in any case, I invite you to create that feeling of inclusivity here and now. This is a safe space, and we can all feel really welcome and comfortable here. Any questions so far about terminology, pace, anything? Volume? Is volume okay? Okay. So now that we have this safe space, right, we can more easily acknowledge that that kind of inclusive context that I'm talking about is not always what we encounter. I'm sure each of you has your own examples, but I'll give a couple of examples from my recent direct experience. When this book came out, the Actually Autistic Guide, my alma mater, Columbia, where I got my doctorate, was the alumni magazine, which reaches about 300,000 very influential readership, right? So they start to write this article about this book, and I see the article and it's fantastic. And then they tell me that the article's not coming out in that issue because they only had room for one article about autism in that issue. And so they chose to publish, prior to publishing the article that was already written about this book that was really inclusive and welcoming and autism affirming, they chose to publish an article on autism prevention research that some scientists at Columbia were doing. Yeah. To their credit, they allowed me to respond to that article when they did publish the article about this book. So that was good, but it was a lot. They were like simultaneously trying to celebrate neurodiversity and eradicate it. So another example is that I have more than once at my talks had people say, stand up and just be like, I don't want to be autistic. And that breaks my heart because I feel that when people feel that way, they feel that way because the neurotypical world has judged them in that way, not because there's anything inherently wrong or inferior about being neurodivergent. And so it's pretty upsetting, but that's why I'm here, right? I'm here to do everything I can so that fewer and fewer people feel that way until no one does. And like most or possibly all of you, I really don't like public speaking. So I really, really care. We need to have some major shifts in perspective and in our actions if we want the future to be better for neurodivergent people. I think that things are improving. They're certainly a lot better for my son's generation than they were for mine. But we still have a long way to go. So what kinds of change do we want, right? What kinds of spaces and cultures will genuinely nurture and uplift us? If you take just a moment to bring your neurodivergent loved ones to mind, possibly including yourself, what do we truly want that better world to look like? What do we need to consider or think about? What do we need to do if we're going to bring about a better world for neurodivergent people?
I think inform people. I think a lot of people are ignorant.
Yeah.
They don't know. I didn't know.
Yeah.
When my grandson was diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
What is it?
Mm-hmm.
How how can we cure it?
Right,
What's the
right,
treatment?
right. Got to make it better. Right, exactly. How can we fix this broken person? Right, exactly. Yeah,
That's what you, I mean,
Yeah.
if you were not faced with that,
yeah.
you don't know
Right.
what to expect.
Right. So one of the things that, and I'm going to talk about this more in a little bit, but we kind of try to take this radical stance of accepting people before we know about it. But that's not our natural human reaction at all. That's not what people do naturally. Certainly not most neurotypical people don't do that. So yeah. So we've created this small space tonight, right, where people who don't fit that norm can bring their whole selves. How do we develop and live that kind of inclusivity in less friendly environments? And then how do we persevere until there are fewer and fewer of those non-welcoming spaces? And in our model, we start with ourselves, and then we work outward from there. So I'm going to share with you some principles behind advocating to foster those kinds of spaces. And then I'm also going to share some down-to-earth suggestions for real actions you can take, whether you're looking to evolve a home. I get a lot of readers or people who come to my talks who are educators or work in the school system in general. Maybe you're looking to create a better sensory environment, or you're looking to help with your own or your child's competencies, emotional competencies, practical skills. We have a lot of different suggestions, more in the book or in the discussion guide, around those kind of things. But the principles that I'm going to start with, those are things that can apply to all of those different settings of the home or schools or workplaces. Okay, so how are we doing? Questions? Anybody? Okay. I will take. So why hashtag actually autistic? Our message, first and foremost, is that the change that we work for as autism advocates and allies and self-advocates should fundamentally be shaped by those who will be most affected by that change. Now, of course, just like neurotypical people, we neurodivergent people are not monolithic or all the same, right? My son and I are completely opposite. In fact, when he was about to go through the process of being diagnosed for autism, I insisted that there was no way that he was autistic because we're so different. We're opposites. He's a sensory seeker. He's always kind of just like rolling around trying to get things, and I am an avoider. I can get migraines just like from existing. In fact, I may get a migraine later from fluorescent lights. Really get me for some reason. I was so freaked out by the tornadoes that I didn't even deal with that. But I get migraines constantly from anything, seeing a bright color, smelling something. And my son, we used to call him the Arctic seal because he would swim in like water that nobody else would ever even like come near. So we need really different things as we move through the world, my son and I. But what we share is this need to be heard and seen as people with equal worth and our own unique way of being. So my co-author and I, we wanted to not just build awareness, as you brought up, but we wanted to make a really strong, logical case for acceptance. And for us, that includes respect for neurodiversity, knowledge about neurodiversity, inclusion, not tolerance, right? So tolerance generally sets, you know how people say, oh, they're so tolerant. Like, it sets the tolerant group above the people who are tolerated, right? And it kind of rewards the tolerators for being so patient and so big-hearted, you know, rather than just saying like, hey, we're equal. Like, nobody's doing anybody a favor by talking to them, right? So real inclusion means genuine welcoming and belonging. And acceptance also includes justice. And by that I mean that in institutions and in cultures and societies, autistic people have equity, a level playing field, and as well as equal rights. So I want to also be clear, though, that while acceptance might consist of all of the things that I just listed and other things that you can stick in there, it actually fundamentally means that you don't need to know the details of my way of being a person, of who I am, whether that might be my gender identity, my neurology, my sexuality, my race or ethnicity, nationality, physical abilities, intellectual abilities. You don't need to know any of those things to, on a very basic level, accept me, right? And offer me the same respect that you would give any human being. Like, So that's one of the main things that we argue is just, you don't, like, awareness is good, but acceptance is better. And acceptance should come first. Like, before we decide to learn about something, we should operate from the premise that this person is a human being who's of equal worth. That's not always easy for everyone. Some people think that's kind of radical. So to promote these values that we believe in, of equity and equality and real acceptance, we wanted to find out what autistic people themselves say about, for this book, the first book, how neurodivergent people can advocate for themselves better and advocate for those they care about, and then how neurotypical people can be genuinely supportive advocates and allies. We also believe that these actually autistic perspectives are really important input when we're figuring out definitions for autism, how autism should be framed within the medical communities or the psychological communities or academic communities. And that also actually autistic perspectives are really important when we think about how best to speak up around or align with an individual autistic person's needs or preferences, as well as the wider autistic community, how to advocate or ally with the wider autistic community. So we asked all these people, lots and lots of people, about the key elements of really effective advocacy that would be respectful and inclusive based on their life experiences. And then in this round, when we were working on the next book, we asked all these young people about their path toward adulthood. What could make it better, happier, healthier, more successful on their own terms. And in all of these cases of the people we interacted with, well, not all of them, but most of them, we also heard about challenges and mistakes and outright failures. And we've had those ourselves too. But the most important thing in all of that was just this idea of being open to learning more about it, having that, I know it's sort of almost ubiquitous now, but that idea of having a growth mindset, right? And I just also want to mention that with the Actually Autistic hashtag, some neurotypical people do find it alienating. And I wanted to explain that we don't use this hashtag or this title to exclude anyone, but just because historically autistic voices have really been oppressed. And even when I sent this book to a relative, and the whole book is about listening to autistic people, and then I said that we're writing another one for teens and young adults, and she said that she had been talking about it with her local librarian friend, and they were both hoping that we could include more perspectives from parents and professionals. It's kind of like, well, there's a lot of that out there, but we're doing something different, Pat. So there is like some pain in this community, right, from all those centuries of being ignored and infantilized. You know, a lot of autistic people historically have been institutionalized, discriminated against, and oppressed. So I think that does sometimes come out in anger or defensiveness, right? So I also want to note that kind of pain that a lot of autistic people struggle with, or anger, it does come from the challenges of being autistic in a neurotypically designed world, right? Most of the judgments that people use around people are what we refer to as neuronormative, right? They're based on the values of neurotypical culture, and not necessarily, autistic people don't necessarily come out looking that great in that culture sometimes. So the anger that I think people feel I think it's legitimate. I don't think it's inherent to autism. I think it's inherent to being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. And I'll give you some scientific proof of that in a little bit. But in any case, there's a lot we can do as autistic people and people who care about them to mitigate this pain and difficulty. And so that's mostly what we focus on. I'm only going to touch the surface here, so please feel free to get in touch with me outside of here. I think that my email is at the top of the mailing list, but I'm happy to share it with anyone, or just put your email on the mailing list and I'll reach out to you. In the next few days, I'll send you the resources that I talked about, and then you can write me back and say, okay, I don't want to be on the mailing list, or I do, or here are some questions. That's fine too. Okay. Any questions right now? Yeah.
The people that you spoke to, were any of them diagnosed as adults?
Some, yeah.
Do you remember the ages?
I don't. I mean, I could give you some examples. Like, I was diagnosed in my 30s, but a lot of the people who, interesting, a lot of people who we interviewed or surveyed for our newer book, most of them were diagnosed as children or teens, and we talked about that. But some of them were diagnosed as children or teens, but weren't told about it, and that's another thing that people were pretty upset about. You know, so
My son.
So
I didn't
yeah.
tell my son until he was about 10. He was
Yeah.
angry with me. But
Yeah. No, it's, I mean, you know, I have an opinion about that. I think it's different for every family.
it was
but-
a mistake. I didn't do it on purpose, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that
Something slipped.
even using the word diagnosis, which I have a lot of rants. You can look it up. I have rants about that online too. I mean, diagnosis is a medicalized term, right? I believe that neurodiversity is a natural human way of being, and I'll talk about that more. But there is a lot of stigma attached to labeling and diagnosis, and there's a lot of medicalization of it as well. And yeah.
But I think you need a diagnosis to get help.
Anything.
Well, right,
Anything.
exactly.
So
So,
there's no
yes,
way that you
yeah.
can not go.
Yeah, so it's tricky, right?
Yeah.
That's a really, really tricky question. But I think that in general, my counsel, based on not so much my own experience, because I myself am autistic, and I'm really, if someone tells me, okay, this is really private, don't tell anyone, I can handle that. Like, I'm very trustworthy, but I'm also very open about things. So with my son, we kind of went through it all at the time that it was happening, and I just tried to support him as much as possible. So when I speak about this question, or what the question has evolved into, I'm speaking from what I'm hearing from autistic young people that they would like to know. They would like to know what they're, you know, and I think a good way to work with it is to talk about neurodivergence as a natural human variety. You know, that was something that I think is helpful too. But yeah, we do have some adult diagnosed people too. Yeah. Was
I
there?
think someone talked about how hard it was to get a diagnosis.
Yes, yes. I have a couple of people who talked about. I have one person who's in the book who's actually became a friend because they reached out because of the first book, and they happened to live near me, and et cetera, and they went through a very difficult journey. Also, it's very expensive, right? Yeah.
One place
So-
wanted $6,000 from me.
Oh yeah, no, it's really expensive. There's a lot of affirmation of self-diagnosis in the autism community. I personally self-diagnosed in my 20s, and when I was diagnosed by a professional, I was kind of like, yeah, I knew that. But also, there's a lot of irreverence toward authority, I think, also perhaps in the autistic community, to some extent, at least the adult autistic community. So, but I happen to have a kind of healthcare that I was in Vermont, and I didn't have to pay for it. So that was kind of a miracle. But yeah, it's expensive, it's controversial, it can be really tricky. It can be,
Is there any advantage
yeah.
to it, just objectively?
Yeah.
Advantage to it.
And right, so part of what you were mentioning is that for younger people, I gotta keep an eye on the time. Okay, I'm gonna get to my principles in a second. But for younger people moving through the school system, it can be incredibly helpful to have some tools around labeling and diagnosis, right? For insurance, it can be a big help, like those things. So it's not nothing, right? But when you're an adult, what is it getting you? You know, you're not, what are the services? I mean, that's one of the things we write about a lot in this Building Independence book, is like, there's very little out there, even for us who, like, it's our job
But
to
this
figure
is
it
a
out.
state that provides a lot.
Massachusetts is a good state to live in, yeah.
Outstanding compared to other states.
Yes.
It
Well,
is.
yeah,
Yeah.
Diagnosis is validation of your
Yeah,
own.
but
Yes,
even
that too.
treatment and school services, everything is above, I think, many states in the country.
Massachusetts is also one of the more progressive states, so
Yes,
they're
that's-
very affirming of, you know, like, people's identities and people's needs and stuff like that, so yeah. All right, I'm only gonna talk for about 5 more minutes. I definitely wanna get to some of them are principles, real quick, and then I'll open up for more questions. Okay. So let me get to. I'm gonna skip a bunch of stuff, and I'm just gonna talk about our principles that we talk about in our introduction. Okay. And so this is like the groundwork for all of the sort of practical things that we suggest and the philosophical things we suggest. I want to talk about something that I don't know why I hadn't heard about it earlier, but it's been a really revelatory thing for me. It was the science that I talked about earlier. Dr. Damian Milton did this experiment, and the result he called the double empathy problem. So his experiment consisted of 3 different groups of people playing a modified game of telephone. One of the groups was all neurotypical. One of the groups was all autistic, and one group was mixed. So the neurotypical group did a whiz-bang great job with the game of telephone. So did the autistic group, okay? The group that really didn't do well was the mixed group. So when I was sitting with a friend who has an autistic daughter, but she herself is neurotypical, and she told me this, and I mean, I've been an academic for a long time, been writing about autism, never heard of it. And when she told me that, I just started crying, and she was like, "Why are you crying?" And I was like, "It just explains everything," you know? And then also, I felt like it shed light on the ways that autistic people are often blamed, and sometimes blame themselves. For my generation, not knowing why I was different and weird, I just assumed I was wrong all the time, and there was something wrong with me, and I blamed myself, right? My son, not so much, but certainly in my generation. So we often blame ourselves or are blamed for what is actually a mutual communication issue. And you could also think of it as an environmental problem, you know, something where one person is living in a different context than another. I think that the autism industry is changing, but it's focused on fixing us for a long time. And that experiment provides a really good introduction to our basic premise, which is basically that communication and environmental problems that autistic people encounter, they happen because we're neurodivergent people in a world that is entirely designed for neurotypical people. But these problems that we have, there's something that we can mitigate. There's something that we can even vanquish with the right approach, right? And also, this is really important, without placing all the burden on autistic people. So our very first section in our introduction begins to establish this approach with our first basic ground rule, which asks would-be autism advocates and allies to direct their efforts in a positive direction, rather than trying to fix things or thinking that autism is a tragedy, working toward positive change, working toward that awareness, working toward that acceptance. You're all here, so I think I can safely say that we kind of want to make the world a better place for neurodivergent individuals, a place where this game of telephone looks a little bit better for us. So instead of fear and sadness and looking for a cure, the autistic people we heard from, and we heard from a lot, we both of us are also, in addition to all the interviews and surveys that we did for this, we're both pretty deep in a communities of autistic people. So what we hear all the time is that autistic people want others to know that there are things we can do with our energy that actually uplift us and make the world a more equitable and safe and fair place for neurodivergent people. And so I encourage all of you to really understand that you're allowed to ask for those things. You're allowed to ask for people to see things differently and to see you or your partner or your child or your student in a more evolved way. I think I'm just going to have time for the second basic ground rule, but it has one of my favorite awful stories in it, which is that being an advocate or ally really rests on respect and listening. So the actually autistic people who we talk to really want people to advocate or ally with care, right? There are a lot of organizations out there that autistic people see as pretty demeaning. There are a lot of practices out there that seem discriminatory, but you're not going to know that if you only listen to certain people. If you listen to actually autistic people, you're going to hear differently than you might hear in the mainstream. And by the way, all this guidance that I'm talking about, it really pertains in most cases to all differences. whether that's learning differences or mental health differences, cognitive differences, physical differences. Whenever possible, and it's almost always possible, this second basic ground rule asks you to listen to the people who experience that difference when you look to be an ally or advocate. And I'm going to give you an example from my life that doesn't make me look so great, I think, maybe, although the parents out there will understand. So over time, my son taught me how he needed me to advocate for him, not based on my own agenda, but on what he actually needed. And this is when he was a little older, right? When you have young kids, you have to kind of make a lot of choices yourself. You can't be like, oh, whatever you want, honey. But with older kids, sometimes they can start to know their own heart. So my son, in his junior year, so his junior year was 2018, 2019, so before the pandemic. He worked really, really, really hard, and basically he was being threatened to be taken off his IEP. He's super, super smart, very sensitive. He was a special education student, and he felt a lot of stigma around that. He felt a lot of shame from his peers. Certainly at home, I talked about nothing but different great ways of learning and how if you have a weakness in this area, you have a strength in the other, But he wasn't buying it because he basically, knew what they said about the special ed kids, and he couldn't take it. He hated it. So he worked really, really hard. By the way, as an aside, I have a whole section in this book, the new book, about changing special education to take the stigma out of it, and some things that can be done about that. But anyway, in this example, he just worked his butt off so that we were in his 3-year IEP, and they're like, he doesn't need his IEP anymore. Now, they knew me, and they knew that if I wanted him to have his IEP, I was going to fight, and it was going to be really ugly, like really ugly. So they're all sitting there like, oh boy, it's this one. And but Ernie, I shouldn't use his name, my son looked at me and said, he said, Mom, do you trust me? And in that moment, I thought, oh my gosh, I know he's going to bomb out of school. This is going to be a disaster. My son has no executive function whatsoever. He can walk from there to there and lose something. And there's where did it go? You don't even know, but he really has no executive function. So I was terrified. But I decided that for him, for his self-esteem and trust and everything else, that it was more important that he know that I believed in him than that I fight for that IEP. So guess what? He wrote his college application essay on how he got off his IEP and onto the honor roll. He stayed on the honor roll until graduation in a pandemic. He was accepted at and offered partial scholarships to full scholarships at all of the 8 colleges he applied to. 2 or 3 years before that, I would never have thought he was college bound. Now, what happened after that, with his first semester being fall of 2020 and the pandemic, was another and less uplifting story. But the story isn't over yet. So I encourage you to believe that you are empowered to ask people to listen to and respect you in your advocacy. And I encourage you to listen to and respect the autistic people in your life when they tell you what they need as far as advocacy and allyship goes. So I'm going to leave it there so that we can have some questions and answers, and just say thank you. I got through about 3/5 of my talk. So there's lots more in there. But there's the discussion guide, there's the book, and please sign up for my mailing list. But does anyone have questions?
They don't tell you how to advocate for them, what they need.
So if you have a non-speaking or a teenager?
Early 20s.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that, again, I always feel really uncomfortable saying buy the book, or the second book, but you can also look at the free discussion guide. There are a lot of, you'll be able to see from those things that things that feel respectful and that feel autism affirming and things that don't. Autism is indeed a developmental difference. So that means, for example, for me, I'm still learning a lot of things that I think are probably already obvious to my 18-year-old daughter. Adulting goes very differently. One of the things that a lot of the autistic people who responded to our independence building survey talk about: patience, seeing their efforts for what they are. Sometimes, I know a lot of people whose 20-something kids are in the basement, and that includes me. And I'm just trying to see that as, okay, right? But I really think at some point they're going to find their way. So I think that the other thing that I think is really hard for both autistic people themselves and parents of autistic people is when to push and when to respect that maybe they're doing all they can in that moment. That's a really hard one. So if they don't tell you what they want or need in terms of advocacy, I think that getting familiar with different perspectives would be, different autistic perspectives would be really, really helpful. There's a book, and I'm so jealous of it because it's a huge bestseller, by Devin Price, and I think it's called There's No Such Thing as Laziness, and it's about, are you nodding? Do you know what somebody knows what I'm talking about? Did I say? Oh, okay. It's about how a lot of times autistic people will be in a place where it looks like they're being lazy, but they're actually not. I'm a very incredibly driven autistic person, and it's like I have a hard time understanding like how that works, but I respect that it's a thing,
Well, everybody's different.
Yeah, everybody's different. And, a 20-year-old autistic boy or 25-year-old autistic male is going to be a lot younger than like my neurotypical daughter when she was 12. Like it's really different developmentally. Now they may be intellectually my son is like one of the smartest people I've ever known, but like that's intellectual, right? There's these different pieces. Yeah, autism is not a mental health or cognitive issue. But it is a developmental difference. So, you could have the smartest person in the world, and I really like to play with some things that were pretty young and far into my 20s.
There seems to be a fine balance between where you stop pushing and guiding and just let it go and nothing gets done.
Right. And you don't want to push. I understand, and you don't want to push to that point where you're alienating your child. Right, and I've certainly gotten to that point with my child because again, I'm very driven. I'm not doing like a neurotypical discrimination against the autistic person. I'm doing like the, super driven autistic person with the less driven one. So I don't really have the answer for that, but in terms of exactly what you should do. But I think it's really important to educate yourself around perspectives from the autistic community.
Getting the book. Sometimes reading about it, and I think that's a good way of them to understand also how other people feel
and see them, right? So
Which is why I would like him to include himself in peer groups of the same neurodivergent population.
Yes, absolutely.
But that doesn't seem like something that we have been able to do. We say, hey, this is going on, but
Do you know if he has online communities? Like, does he connect with people online? Like
through gaming.
Right. So one of the things that a lot of our respondents said, and I think, again, this is another thing that didn't really resonate with me, but I really have to listen to it because a lot of people are saying it, is that for a lot of autistic young people, those online gaming communities are social interactions. They have friends. They don't think, oh, I need friends. And you think they need friends, but they don't think that.
Right.
Like, I think, how could you possibly be happy living in the basement and gaming? And my son's happy. I mean, he is. Like, you have to wrap your brain around that. And then, of course, there's always the concerns of like, okay, what happens when I go?
What's hard to see, though, is that doesn't include him in a social society and him be able to function outside of that basement situation where he's talking to his gaming friends.
But he may need, this is sort of, again, I'm sorry, the books that I'm now selling is not available. But he may need a few extra years like that, especially because of what we've just been through as a world, right? So I think that a lot of sensitive and vulnerable populations, including a lot of autistic people, are still grappling with coming out of that terror that we all lived in, and if we weren't terrified, then we were angry, or we were both, so I think I don't know where you draw the line, but I think that he may need more time. And I hope that you can find some resources of people talking about that, because it's a challenge as a parent, for sure. And I feel you. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, off the top of your head, I don't know if you know this, but do you know at like what age or what year you'd be confident that an autistic child would be, identified in the school system?
Oh, okay, so the answer to that is absolutely no idea. It could be completely different from one to another. Like the friend I was talking about before who told me about the double empathy problem, her daughter was diagnosed in her 8th grade or 9th grade. My son was diagnosed in 2nd grade. It's sort of, one of the things that has to do with is whether there might be some learning differences or executive function challenges. I was never diagnosed in the school system because my superpower is academics. You know what I mean? But I was struggling. I was really struggling. Socially, my God.
Well,
So,
what they did with those kids
yeah.
back when I went to school was they put them ahead of you.
Well, right. I was an AT, academically talented. And that was my diagnosis. Until I was diagnosed autistic, I was like a genius,
Yeah.
right? But I was last picked in gym, awkward, so it's really different for every student. And I think that you can't really answer that. Yeah, it just really depends. Like, is the student really good at academics? We have a lot of not a lot, but quite a few respondents talk about kind of falling through the cracks because they were good at academics.
There's one thing about the autism community is that I see as a problem that I don't hear talked about.
Okay.
It's that the problem with adults diagnosed as adults is that it's an ephemeral problem. It's going to go away because the younger kids, the younger generation, anybody below 35 or 30 has been through a school system that more than likely would have.
Oh, right. I see what you're saying. Yeah. So that, yeah.
1977, not so much.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He didn't speak.
Yeah.
And he had repetitive movements.
Yeah. So he might have been diagnosed in 1977,
No,
but
my
we weren't. Yeah.
grandson, it was diagnosed, he's 16 now, 15.
Yeah.
He was 18 months old.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If you don't know about it, and my other daughter saw him going around the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets, and she read, she's a teacher, she read about it, and she said, I would have him tested.
Yeah.
And I think, so what I find difficult is, he was playing with the kitchen cabinet doors, and to me it was like, was going as a walker, and it was nothing for my generation.
Yeah.
But if you don't know about it, that's why
Right.
I think it's so important that people understand about what we're talking. It's not mental retardation.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Confuse it.
They do very much. Yeah. But I think that's asking a lot of the entire population to understand the details. That's why we always say, like, let's start with acceptance. But I totally agree with you. Like, if people, had more awareness, they would definitely treat everyone better. And then I ask myself, why do you have to have more awareness to treat people better? And kids can be brutal.
But even pediatricians should know.
Oh, no.
about it and say, if you see this, and we never had any of that.
Pediatricians should know that, and they should also know other things like, I get a lot of local advocates and parents contacting me because pediatricians are discriminatory, so it's like it kind of goes both ways. There's a lot of different issues out there that I think less ignorance would definitely help with. Yeah.
That's a good momentum for a problem that's only in the last 15 years.
For the late diagnosis issue, but for our children, yeah.
It's like, well, we'll just wait it out.
Yeah, but for our children, and that's one of the things that we talk about a lot in both books, is just how to make things truly, and very practical ways, as well as philosophical ways, how to make things better for children and teens and young adults.
That's very
So,
important.
yeah.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah, oh, thank you.
It's good to have a guide. Yes.
Any other questions?
What do you do about a school system that won't keep kids from bullying their autistic son?
Oh, God. I moved That's, I mean, I moved.
To the point.
I literally
where
moved,
so
yeah.
They goaded him to
Yeah.
saying the magic words and got
Yeah.
suspended for 10 days.
Yeah, no, I actually literally moved when my kid was getting bullied so badly. And I had some people did things about it and some people didn't, and it was so bad that we moved. I mean, I have other suggestions than that, but that kind of reflects how hard it is.
I was
It's
gonna
really
have him
hard.
keep a log of what,
Yeah.
who, when,
Yeah.
and who he told.
Yeah.
Because then I can go into the principal's office and say.
Yeah, but that can also get him in trouble with his peers. You know, it's like it's really, really hard with the bullying. And we're we have a whole big section in which I did something that like you're not really supposed to do as a writer, which was I gave my personal opinion in all capitals. Like, I don't know if the publisher is going to let that be a thing, but it was like, schools must do everything in their power to eradicate this terrible bullying, you know?
All in black
Yeah,
and white in
yeah.
the student handbook, exactly what they're
Well, they
supposed to
do, but how do they follow through? I mean, that's true about an IEP too, right? Like,
You go
do
to the
they?
school board and bitch is what you do.
You can do that, and you can, you know, I had a knock down, drag them out, fight with a parent in a parking lot. You know, like there's a lot of, we'll do anything and go to bat for our kids, but the bullying issue is really hard. And someone, one of our survey respondents for the second book said that, I think she was pretty serious, said, if someone's getting bullied, if your child is getting bullied, you should have them evaluated for autism, because autistic people get bullied so much. Like, we are the ones, the target for bullying, and it's really rough. And I think, and then there are a lot of solutions for it, but like, honestly, try all the different things. Try working with the students, try working with the school board, try working with the teacher, all of it.
The problem with bullying just in general is that when you've got the bullied kid and you say X, Y, and Z, and they say, okay, yeah, we've addressed it, and you have
when my
no
daughter,
idea what they did.
when my daughter did, she sent them to jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. My son did taekwondo. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
They are
Yeah.
in the 6th year of jiu-jitsu.
Yes.
And the thing
Yeah.
is, it's not only that they are able to face situations that could be, but the principle
Absolutely.
of it.
Yes.
It was amazing because
Yeah.
they are so good at it.
That's a really good suggestion. My son did taekwondo, and it gave him a certain level of confidence, and it gave him some, you know, he was pretty awkward. It gave him some balance. I did ballet when I was little, or else I would have already fallen over right in front of you from standing. So,
You got him out and got him into physical
yes. Until not, you know, this was when he was younger. Okay.
I have my kid in a D&D group for social skills.
Good. There you go. Yeah. We just like piece it together, you know, and yeah. And I'm happy also. I know we're supposed to end at 8, so I should finish up. But I'm really happy to correspond with anybody here. So please sign in your email on the way out. And if you live around here, join the Friends of the Library. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Thanks.